Think to myself, what a wonderful world. Well, I see skies of blue and I see clouds of white and the brightness of day. I like the dark and I think to myself, what a wonderful world. The colors of the rainbow, so pretty in the sky, are also on the faces of people passing by. I see friends shaking hands, singing, how do you do? They really say, I love you. I hear babies cry and I watch them grow. They'll learn much more than we'll know. And I think to myself, what a wonderful world. Someday I wish upon a star, wake up where the clouds are far behind. Where trouble melts like a lemon drops high above the chimney top. That's where you find me, oh, somewhere over the rainbow, way up high. The dreams that you dare to, why, oh why can't
Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Eva Zabe. I'm the Executive Director of Business for Nature, and it's my absolute pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on why companies are calling for an ambitious Target 15 in the Global Biodiversity Framework and how can it be implemented. For those of you who are new to Business for Nature, we're a global coalition of business organizations calling on governments to adopt policies now to reverse nature loss in this decade. We together demonstrate business leadership and momentum, and we know that companies are already taking action. We know that's not enough. We need to scale and speed up, and that is one of the strongest drivers for that is going to be policy ambition, which in turn will drive even more business action on the ground. So going into Nairobi, we have 3 key priorities. So today we're focusing very much on Target 15. We're going to talk about the need for mandatory requirements for companies to assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature. We're also going to talk about the importance of keeping a numerical target to reduce negative impacts by at least 50%. And we're also going to talk about the need to go beyond just direct operations and look at the full value chain. You can read in our updated position also our other 2 priorities. One is on the mission, Mission 2030. It's essential that companies can align their strategies, their operations to a generally accepted mission, which should be halt and reverse biodiversity loss and achieve a nature positive world by 2030. We are really enthusiastic at the outcome of the Geneva meetings, and we hope that there will be even more consensus and agreement on that mission, which will provide the finish line that we can all race towards collectively. And then the third key priority for us is on Target 18 on environmentally harmful subsidies, the need to keep the ambition to reform incentives, including redirecting or eliminating they need to keep the numerical figure as well. And so just for today, I'm going to hand over to Martin Locke to begin with, the Executive Director of the Capitals Coalition. We have a whole host of speakers for you today, providing so much expertise and experience from companies and other key partners. And we'd really like to be able to answer any questions or hear any feedback you may have. So feel free to use the chat function to do that. We'll try to address them on the call today. And if we don't have time, we will, of course, come back to you. But to kick off, over to you, Martin, for a recap of what our position on Target 15 is all about. Thanks, Martin.
Thank you very much, Eva, and good afternoon, good morning to all of you. My name is Martin Locke, the Capitals Coalition, and we are a global community coming together to change the world by transforming how decisions are made. And Target 15 is a key element in that. And let me please introduce why that is so important for business. First of all, businesses, front-running businesses, already assess and disclose their impacts and dependencies on nature, on biodiversity. But what we hear from them more and more is what would really help to accelerate, to scale up these practices are the introduction of mandatory requirements by governments. That's why we are asking governments to adopt in Target 15 mandatory requirements for business and financial institutions to assess and disclose these impacts and dependencies. And this is necessary because such a mandatory requirement will create a global playing field and ensure fair competition. But furthermore, it will accelerate standardization, and through that, the accountability and the transparency will increase because business governance will be improved by the introduction of such mandatory requirements. Please go to the next slide. So it's not only about the mandatory requirements. Of course, there needs to be an impact, an outcome too. That's why we are advocating also to include in Target 15 the reduction of negative impacts by at least 50%. And such a numerical target really is important because business needs clear, measurable and time-bound goals and a sense of urgency. And the science is clear. The current production and consumption patterns are beyond the planetary boundaries. And in order to transform that, we need a clear goal to work towards. So this is also an important role of governments. Business can take the lead, but we need to collaborate between business and government. Governments can help to break down targets at the national level, to prioritize categories of impacts, to identify specific contributions for a sector. And also governments need to support and help further develop tools, existing tools like the science-based targets or the guidance provided through TNFD, Task Force on Nature-related Financial Disclosure. So, and this is the third point I want to make. It really is important that the need to act across operations, but also value chains, is embedded in Target 15 too. That's why we welcome the addition of across operations and value chains in the first part of the target. This is key not only because this will ask all businesses to work towards their value chain and implement the elements for their own, but also especially large companies through this would collaborate and work together with the SMEs in their value chains to address their impacts. And this is key. We, as Business for Nature, we promote, we push for all companies to be part of Target 50, not only the large companies. SMEs, that's the biggest part of the business community around the world. And they need to be part of this too. Of course, they need an approach that is helpful for them, that is contextual for them with specific support. And an important element for that is to promote that companies collaborate, for example, in their value chains. So that's why we really are promoting this too. So a short introduction to the key 3 elements on target 15. And Eva, back to you to continue this webinar.
Thank you so much, Martin. So let's get into some of the detail here. And the proposal for target 15 is indeed ambitious. And you may all be wondering, how will business and financial institutions be able to implement this in practice? The reality is, it's indeed a complex task, but we must not be paralyzed by complexity. And science is clear that action is needed right now and at scale. So the good news is that there are tools and methodologies and frameworks already in place to support and assist businesses in acting now, making target 15 implementable. And now we're going to hear from a series of speakers on how this can be done. So briefly, we have Nadine Mccormick, who's the nature manager at WBCSD. Thomas Lingard, unfortunately, couldn't join today at the last minute as he's unwell, so we wish him well. He's the Global Sustainability Director at Unilever, and I'll try and do some justice and share some of his main points, though, so for all of us to benefit from. And then Guus van Laarhoven is Regenerative Agriculture Lead at FireslandCampina. So I'm going to start with Nadine, who will give us a bit of an overview of the actions that business can take right now to contribute to the implementation of Target 15. So over to you, Nadine. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Eva, and good morning, good afternoon. So as Eva said, I'm with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development. It's a membership organization of 200 member companies who are acting for systems transformation to get to the world that we need to see. Why I'm mentioning it there now is because we want to be seen as leading member companies. We've recently introduced membership criteria, including one on nature, which calls for business, our member companies, to set ambitious science-informed targets to help halt and reverse the loss of nature and to get ready to disclose progress towards that goal. So basically setting the way for a future SBTN, the Science-Based Targets Network, and Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, TNFD. And so the main message here is that WBCSD is also very supportive of this mandatory requirement. We know that leading businesses are taking action already. We've done a deep dive on what our members are doing already. And we know that understanding impacts and dependencies is the first key lever for getting meaningful action in place. A lot of guidance has been existing, actually more than 10, 20 years, that's been busy in the space of business and biodiversity. And I think the good news is, as this slide shows, what we've done is with a group of organizations who work with business, convened through Business for Nature, we've looked across all those different frameworks, the different acronyms, the alphabet, the acronym soup or the acronym tsunami, depending on how you're feeling today. And the good news is that the logic behind all of those different frameworks, whether it's the Natural Capital Protocol, whether it was Act for Nature, whether it's Science-Based Targets for Network or TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, the overall logic is assess and work out what's important and disclose on that, commit, work out what's important for your company to commit on where and can have the most positive and impact, and disclose on that, and then look to act and transform the system. And there's lots of initiatives out there that focus on different parts of the system, whether it's at a site level and biodiversity net gain, or if it's at a supply chain level, or broader landscapes where we start seeing nature-based solutions start coming in. There's lots of guidance there, but they typically would follow this logic. And so this is the reassurance, hope you need, that despite, because there are so many initiatives out there, they do logically come together, and you can then identify the one that you need based on, what's your entry point right now? Is it about understanding and assessing, or is it about maybe maturity levels as well? And so science-based targets for nature really are for companies a bit more advanced on their journey, but there's a lot of initiatives already to get companies going. So I think, with my final message is to direct you towards the Business for Nature website. We've broken down and identified a lot of schemes that help support these actions already, but leading companies are already taking action. And this is why we strongly support this target. Thanks, Eva.
Thanks so much, Nadine. So leading companies already taking action. And I think also what I heard from you there, Nadine, is very much there's a convergence now finally in what's been a very active space. And that convergence means that we're now ripe for that translation into policy, into the global biodiversity framework. So thank you so much. The next speaker was going to be Thomas, as I mentioned, from Unilever. Just a few words on what Unilever's doing. Unilever made a commitment last year in 2021 to help protect and regenerate 1.5 million hectares of land, forests, and oceans by 2030. And that was calculated looking at where the company could have the most impact within its extended value chain. And it built on existing work that they were already doing to protect and regenerate nature. It fits right into their strategy. And just to share some examples, one is on agroforestry in Côte d'Ivoire. Magnum, which you may have heard of, it's Unilever's largest ice cream brand, partnered with WWF and IDH to run a forest restoration program where it will replant 465,000 native trees in the Cavally region, which is one of the most biodiverse areas in the world. There's also work in Indonesia and Malaysia at a landscape level. So Unilever has 5 place-based partnerships where they're focusing on landscapes and jurisdictions for sourcing programs that include conservation and restoration interventions. I'll just jump to one final point, is on regenerative agriculture in North America and Europe, where Unilever is trying to drive the uptake of regenerative agricultural practices and contribute to the restoration of degraded landscapes. So it's not only about always thinking about what more you can do, you also need to restore the degraded landscapes, and particularly supporting programs that of course protect natural ecosystems. They work on cover crops and soil health for soy farmers in Iowa in the US, and they follow 5 principles which are regenerating soils, protecting water, increasing biodiversity, developing climate solutions, and improving farmer livelihoods. So that's a sneak peek into Unilever's work and how they're already implementing this target to a certain degree. And now I'm really pleased to hand over then to Guus van Laarhoven. I've been practicing my Dutch pronunciation, Guus, who's the regenerative agriculture lead at FireslandCampina. So over to you, please. You've been setting yourself at FireslandCampina. You're a milk and dairy company. You've established clear priorities for nourishing a better planet. You've set yourselves a target to reduce negative impacts by about 40%. Please tell us more, and over to you, Guus. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Eva. Yes, indeed, we have set a target, or at least an ambition, for 2050, also to achieve net positive impact. And I said 2050 or sooner because we are still learning a lot what that really means for our business and for our dairy farming. And what is really clear for us is that the impact in general is mainly at the farm, at the milk production, so at the farms of our member farmers as a cooperative. To achieve the net positive impact, we already know we have to decrease the negative impact by avoiding and reducing, and have to increase the positive impact mainly by regenerating. So our focus is on those elements, and not, well, you asked for a figure on how much should we reduce our negative impact. I think, but that really depends a little bit. We are aiming on in general for a 40% reduction, especially on the carbon footprint and nitrogen emissions, but also on land use, and especially related to feed compounds, for example, soy or palm, that is related to deforestation. But I might be one of the few, of the 26%, as Martin showed, that don't totally agree with the blindly reduction of negative impact, because I really believe in the holistic approach, is that we have to find a balance between positive and negative impact. And have the bar too high on negative impacts could lead to the less possibilities on increasing regenerative practices. So there's always a balance. I really believe in safeguards to avoid trade-offs, but it's highly complicated. That's why I also said that we are still learning on what achieving net positive impact really means for us. But what we have done already is that we, well, simply explained is that we have a roadmap that consists of measuring, acting and monitoring, and we have started the measuring by developing the biodiversity monitor together with the WWF and Rabobank, and that biodiversity monitor actually is a way of monitoring biodiversity impact, negative and positive, on farm level. So we are able at this moment already, or from 2018 already on, to monitor the net impact annually on all of our 10,000 member farms, of Dutch member farms. And we have been tracking the developments and the results and improvements. And what we are already doing since 2018 is also encouraging the improvements by rewarding good performances by our farmers. Now, we still are developing this method, as I mentioned, because we're learning every day, and we still have to precisely assess how much do we need to increase and decrease our negative impact, and how does that work in balance with increasing regenerative practices. We are, and because I think that last part is a bit underestimated, that there is so much potential. What we are also doing, because I think increasing regenerative practices has a lot to do with the revenues that are available for farmers, and that's the reason why we are working within the dairy chain. For example, the Sustainable Agriculture Platform, we are working to work towards an international dairy standard on dairy farming that gives us the opportunity to create revenues for farmers throughout the total dairy chain. And because we know that we can't do this alone, we have to do that throughout the total chain. As a cooperative, we know that you can achieve more together than alone.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much. So clearly, strategic vision, getting towards net positive, nature positive, the importance of having a clear methodology, not always easy, and making sure that we're not only talking about reducing the negative impacts, but building back and providing a positive contribution. Thanks so much, Guus. And in fact, thanks all of you for sharing your ways in your own experiences in companies to implement these nature positive actions. And in fact, thank you to Karen for your comment around why mandatory requirements are necessary, because this is the next part of our session. And in fact, as Martin spoke about up front, when we surveyed the companies, over half of which were SMEs, they were actually calling for mandatory disclosure as well. And so let's now dig into this piece, because there is strong support from business for such a mandatory requirement, because it's essential to level the playing field, to demonstrate the urgency, to generate the large-scale actions that are needed. Mandatory disclosure and assessment is important to accelerate standardization, to increase the accountability and transparency, ultimately to empower consumers as well and engage investors. And there we go, that is what we need to accelerate the action on the ground. So the question now is, well, would business and financial institutions have the right tools and frameworks to implement such requirements? And we're now going to hear from two speakers. First of all, Tony Goldner, Executive Director at the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, and then Isabel Tomé Esteban, who's the Head of Biodiversity at Iberdrola. So first of all, Tony, TNFD is a market-led framework initiative building on, which is building a voluntary reporting framework. And just as TCFD did on climate, your objective is to build a framework that is fit for purpose and globally relevant to assist business and financial institutions of all shapes and sizes to disclose their impact and dependencies on nature. So Tony, over to you to tell us how you think the TNFD will support business and government on disclosure. Thanks, Tony.
Great, thanks very much, Eva, and great to be with you all. Just building on your point, Eva, I think really the driver for an initiative like TNFD and some of the responses that you've seen in your survey that you ran is, as you say, around this idea of standardization. I think what we're hearing very clearly at the task force is that market participants are confused. They're tired of having to wade through the so-called alphabet soup. And so there is this push around standardization, and really what the opportunity in front of us is to create a consistent set of decision useful metrics and consistent way of having discussions around nature related risk, and then ultimately leading to disclosure. And just to underscore that Eva's point, that we're a market-led initiative. All of the task force members are from the private sector. While we're funded by government and philanthropy, we are a private sector-led initiative, and we are building a voluntary disclosure regime. And so that may end up becoming mandatory. Of course, that's a decision for regulators and governments to decide, not for us. But we are well underway on the process of building a voluntary set of disclosure mechanisms to provide the sort of standardization and decision useful information that market participants are asking for. And so how are we doing that? Well, we've already put out a beta release of the framework in March last year. Our final recommendations are not due until September next year. And so for the next 15 months or so, we are going through what we call this open innovation approach of building out the TNFD framework around risk management and disclosure. And we've taken a slightly broader approach than just disclosure, because what's also become very clear is that market participants don't just want to be told what to be disclosed. They want to know how to embed nature consideration into their enterprise and portfolio risk management processes. Now, there's existing advice from folks like the Capitals Coalition and the Natural Capital Protocol. The standards, the science-based targets for nature group are also working in very similar ways. And so we're all essentially using the same approach, a natural capital approach, and very much aligned on how to embed nature considerations at both an enterprise and portfolio investment levels. And so there's a lot of consistency in the approach that's coming together, but of course there are different purposes. The reason why TNFD exists is to shape up a set of disclosure recommendations. So how are we going about doing that? Well, there's really 4 layers to the framework that TNFD is building, represented on this slide. At the foundations are a set of core concepts and definitions, where our approach has been to draw very much on the best available science from IPBES and others. And again, what we're trying to do here is create a common language system for government, business, and civil society to talk about how nature is relevant to business. And I think we're making good progress in that regard. The second layer is going to be around metrics and targets. We have some additional advice coming out at the end of June around our overall approach to metrics. And again, we're very much aligning with the public policy targets that are coming out of the Global Biodiversity Framework, and also the corporate target setting approach that's being developed by SBTN. We've got to keep in mind that there are these 2 different targets, the global public policy ones and the corporate ones, that ultimately need to talk to each other. And so the alignment is really important. The third layer of our approach is to develop very practical guidance. How do we actually do this within our company or in our financial institution? And so we've put out some initial guidance along those lines, again, very aligned with some of the existing market practices and tools that we're seeing, but we're now trying to scale those up beyond the early adopters and create an approach and a set of tools that can be used by companies and financial institutions of all sizes. And then finally will be the disclosure recommendations. And our approach has been to work outwards from the TCFD guidance. So we've taken the same 4 pillars approach, but applying those same conceptual foundations that TCFD built for climate, now applying those to the context of nature, which of course is much more complicated because we're talking about a lot more than just half a dozen gases that now need to be measured and considered into impact and risk equations. So we are very aligned with the TCFD approach. Our work is ongoing. We welcome everyone to participate in the development of our
recommendations. We are now entering a process of feedback and consultation, pilot testing of the framework, the beta framework that was released in March. We look forward to input from a wide range of market participants over the next 12 months or so, leading up to our recommendations in September next year. So thanks very much. Over to you, Eva.
Thank you so much, Tony. And for those who are interested, you can already have a look at the beta version of the framework. I think what I'm taking away very much from your presentation there is disclosure by itself is not enough. It's not an end in itself. It's a means to help important decision useful information get into the system, and that focusing very much on dependencies, not only impacts, will help strengthen enterprise risk management systems. So thank you so much, Tony. And I'm now going to hand over to Isabel Tome Esteban from Iberdrola. You're the head of biodiversity at Iberdrola, which is a global energy leading company based in Spain. And in the survey that we talked about earlier, 91% of business responded that they said they were in favor of mandatory requirements to assess and disclose impacts and dependencies. You're one of them. Your company is already assessing and disclosing. So could you please share with everyone briefly, one, why you're already doing so, and two, what mandatory requirements would change for you? Over to you, Isabel. Thank you.
Thank you, Eva, and all for this webinar. As you said, Iberdrola is an energy utility company who has a broad scope. We are in 5 main countries all over the world, so we are very multinational. And we support the recommendations made by Business for Nature on Target 15 because we have been voluntarily disclosing our management approach and our relationship with nature for the last 18 years. In 2004, we produced our first sustainability report following a GRI, the Global Reporting Initiative indicators. In 2007, we already produced our first biodiversity report. In 2008, our first carbon footprint, and 2016, our first corporate environmental footprint report, which also measures impact on biodiversity. So we are disclosing to allow stakeholders to see company performance and engage with our investors and shareholders. Transparency is part of our governance and sustainability system and is one of our policy commitments. So regarding the other question, need for mandatory requirements and why it changed for us, well as for climate. And we, as Martin mentioned, biodiversity is a complex issue, and we truly believe that having a common language on biodiversity with investors, shareholders, and society has never been so important. So that's why we need from governments clear rules and standards, and for better transparency and comparability. We have used several frameworks and methodologies along the years on how to assess and our impacts and dependencies, and we know how costly and time and resources can be, but biodiversity, as I said, is a complex issue, and that's why we need a robust and stable guiding principles to assess these impacts, but we need them to be considered materiality. All the companies has the same level of impacts and dependencies on biodiversity, but and they need to be simple, as simple as possible. We need to think this as a journey of improvement, and let's not perfect be on the way of good. We start, and more important at all is that we need a meaningful KPIs for stakeholders and for companies, that they actually they are something that you can manage your then decisions, integrate them into your decision making. We also need the support from administrations and providing sound environmental databases. and tools that help us to assess and value more efficiently. Because as I said, it's a complex issue. We thought that carbon was easy, but then it wasn't so easy. And biodiversity, there are many factors that can be taken into account, and we need to simplify those. And we need help from the governments with databases that we can do that more efficiently. On this journey, we believe that participation on this from different stakeholders through consultation processes is essential on developing these regulations as well.
Thank you so much, Isabel. And it makes me smile to think, 2007 was your first biodiversity report, probably one of the first companies to have done so. And then look at your title, Head of Biodiversity. We're seeing more and more companies have important positions like yours within a company because it's become strategic. But we do need those shared language, shared rules, meaningful KPIs, so that ultimately companies can compete on performance and not on methodologies, as is sometimes the case. So as in the chat, there was a bit of an exchange there on really what's the rationale for calling for mandatory assessment and disclosure. Well, to be honest, voluntary is what we've been doing up until now, and we know that the scale and speed of action is nowhere near enough. It's essentially voluntary would be more of the same. So we need to shift and take a systems transformation view of the whole accountability system, and that comes with having the requirement to share the information. So thank you so much to both of you. And now we're going to go into the last part of our webinar, which is really how do we measure success? So we've heard from some of the businesses on how an ambitious Target 15 can be implemented and why mandatory requirements are an important element to keep in the target. And so let's now address this very important question of how do we measure success? It's essential to consider if we want to have targets that are smart and realistic. So we have three speakers with us today. First, Oscar Sabag, who's the Science Translation Lead at the Science Based Targets for Nature. We have Renata Polini, Head of Nature, another cool title, Head of Nature at Holcim, and Sharon Brooks, Principal Business and Biodiversity Specialist at UNEP WCMC. So handing first to you, Oscar, the SBTN, Science-Based Targets for Nature network is developing a framework to enable companies to define a clear and science-based pathway to ensure they're doing enough across their value chain to address their impacts on nature and to help measure progress. So please, Oscar, can you tell us more about how SBTN can support business implementation of Target 15? Over to you, Oscar. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for the introduction. So yeah, at the Science Based Targets Network, we have the mandate to translate global societal goals into individual targets for companies and cities. The methods that we use are science-based, and they provide the tools for businesses to effectively assess, measure, and act on their impacts on nature. We want businesses to both reduce their negative impacts, but also deliver positive contributions and eventually transform our relationship with nature. We use guidance based on a 5-step framework, which is what you see on the screen, but that is fully aligned with the ACT-D framework that Nadine presented earlier in the call. And so what I want to do is explain how this supports company action. The first part is that the early steps of the process help companies to assess and prioritize their impacts, taking an angle of societal materiality and focusing on the main indicators of impacts on nature that company operations have. This guidance is built on existing tools and models, and it can help companies, for example, quantify what their operations means in terms of physical pressures on the environment, and also understand where along its many value chains, nature will be most at risk of issues such as species extinction, and thus where action will be a top priority. We have also developed methods to set quantitative science-based targets on issues such as water quantity and water quality. These methods are based on local or global hydrological models, scientific research on what a safe ecological threshold is, and fair and equitative sharing principles among stakeholders. With that, an individual company can define the reductions in the water extractions that they would need to set so that they can help maintain adequate environmental water flows in surface waters or stabilize depleting aquifers, and also define the reductions that would be required on their nutrient loading to water bodies so that they would prevent eutrophication and maintain water quality levels. We're also developing methods to support companies to assess and reduce pressures on terrestrial ecosystems. And there, the focus will be on issues such as land conversion and degradation. Now, our guidance and methods have already been tested by companies in our corporate engagement program, and currently they're under an extensive review and approval process. We are including the feedback we're getting from companies, civil society organizations, and sustainability experts right now. And we expect to release all of this guidance for public use in the first quarter of 2023. That means that at that point, companies will be able to set and validate their science-based targets on nature. Last two things I want to mention is that while our methods enable companies to take action and to understand how much is required from them individually, this is still a voluntary effort. So the transparency and accountability that would come from mandatory disclosure requirements would make a huge difference in having widespread adoption and us being able to see enough action at the aggregated level. And that having a numerical target in a global goal for nature, such as Target 15, would both provide a very strong signal for companies to take meaningful actions, but also it will give us a very clear, societally accepted anchor, such as the 1.5 degrees of the Paris agreements that we can use to align our targets to. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Oscar. Really important to frame it in the actual pressures also that companies have on the environment, the importance, for example, as you mentioned, maintain water flows, nutrient loading management, etc. So also good to hear the importance and the way we can scale your efforts through Target 15, being ambitious as we're talking about, and good luck in the final stretch to the release in Q1 2023. So thank you so much, Oscar. And now let's hear from business. I'm going to hand over to Renata Polini, who's the head of nature at Holcim, the largest cement producer in the world. And in Holcim's nature positive strategy by 2030, Holcim has actually committed to have a measurable positive impact on biodiversity. So Renata, can you tell us how you plan to measure that? Thanks so much. Over to you.
Thank you, Eva. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you today. So first of all, I would like to mention that Holcim supports the recommendations made by Business for Nature on Target 15. The reason, and I'm seeing a lot of questions on the chat, and the reason why we support is that we truly believe that what gets measured gets done. So by making mandatory for business to assess and disclosure their impacts on dependence on biodiversity, we are incentivizing businesses that are not measuring their impact to start measuring it. And as a consequence, this will accelerate our actions towards a nature positive future. So as Eva mentioned, we launched our new nature strategy in September last year, committing to a measurable positive impact on biodiversity. And how are we measuring our progress toward these targets? So basically, we are applying in all our queries, it's more than 900 sites, a scientific methodology called BIRS, Biodiversity Indicator and Reporting System. This methodology was developed in partnership with the IUCN, the NGO that I think all of you know. And in a nutshell, the methodology has 3 steps. The first one is the quantity. Here we measure the extent of every habitat in a site. You have to think that a site may have different habitats. So the first step on the methodology is to measure the extent, so the area that we are covering for every habitat. The second step is the quality. For every habitat in a site, we assess the current ecological condition and also the biodiversity suitability. The third step is the importance, where we assess the uniqueness of every habitat. At the end of the exercise, we will have for every habitat a biodiversity score that can be aggregated to a site final biodiversity index. So this is very good. This methodology allows aggregation, which really is helping the business to set the targets and really measure towards a positive impact. Now, if you look to our timeline, at the bottom of the slides, you see that we launched our strategy in 2021. We will establish our biodiversity baseline by 2024 by applying BIRS in all our queries. And then by 2030, we are going to measure again using the same methodology. And the idea is that our biodiversity index should have a higher value for us to conclude we are moving towards a positive state of biodiversity. At the moment, we have 35% of our land covered with BIRS. So we still have a long way to go these next 3 years. But our operations in the countries are committed to deliver this target. So we are very optimistic that we are going to reach our 2024 milestone with the baseline. And also that by 2030, we are going to reach a biodiversity positive state. With that, I give the words back to you, Eva.
Thanks so much, Renata. So a very practical methodology that cuts through, I guess, some of the complexity, given that you're implementing this on all of your sites. So a lot of sites in Holcim. Good luck with all of that, and thank you again for sharing. So now I'd like to turn to Sharon. Sharon Brooks is the Principal Business and Biodiversity Specialist at UNEP WCMC, has great experience on the subject. So Sharon, can you please explain how governments can measure a target to reduce negative impacts by 50%? Thanks so much, Sharon, over to you.
Great, thank you, Eva, and good morning, good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. So yeah, I'm going to be building on a bit what we've heard about already around how businesses can and are achieving such targets to meet the target 15, and to what governments can be doing to measure the progress of businesses and indeed put those sort of enabling conditions in place. As Eva pointed out, the ambition of this target is really important for both businesses and governments to take the right actions and put the right enabling policies in place. And UNEP WCMC is therefore very supportive of the Business for Nature's position, as it sees this as critical to drive the change that we need. So for governments to measure progress, it requires those mechanisms to be in place at national level, which, as we know, are largely absent at the moment. But they can really be enabled through a number of key efforts. So if we start with the top left-hand corner of this diagram, which is what we've been talking around a lot, is how businesses do measure their impacts and dependencies. I'm going to be largely speaking about impacts today, using that understanding of, so what are the metrics that they need to use in terms of the biodiversity state and the pressures on them. We heard a lot from Tony around the role of the TNFD in driving sort of standardization and how this is happening. And really, I suppose this is the first point, isn't it, that we've been talking around, this role of mandatory requirements and in terms of driving that standardization. So we've got emerging mandatory requirements coming out from Europe and other countries, and the adopting the TNFD framework, the standardized metrics, is really one of the key ways that we can start to get that standardized way, and the standardized way of understanding, measuring and disclosing impacts and dependencies. So I think that that's really the first opportunity. But of course, that's very much about trying to standardize across businesses and how businesses measure and report. The other area of alignment that I think would be a really important enabler here is between how to align between how businesses are measuring and reporting and how countries are assessing impacts, both within their jurisdiction, but also the impacts that are embodied within trade. So in order to have some alignment between how companies are looking at their direct operations within countries, as well as those that occur through their value chains, through supply chains. So we need that alignment. So as countries are starting to develop national indicators to be able to measure progress within their countries, related to their trade, we can look for alignment there And that's really an opportunity, what the CBD process is able to help drive the development and operationalization of those kind of indicators for countries that can be built into and aligned with those for businesses. Now, the third piece that's really important to enable this whole assessment and reporting by businesses is, of course, the biodiversity data itself, which underpins these metrics. So that understanding of the state of biodiversity on which you need to link to the pressures that are exerted by business activities. So what is the state of the ecosystems and the species? And that data is hugely important. And that's where the national assessments, national accounts can be extremely important to try to underpin the development of these metrics. So this means generating, compiling and making accessible up-to-date authoritative spatial information related to biodiversity, which can be facilitated through the national accounts based on the UN system of environmental economic accounting. So those are the 3 points that I wanted to make. It's about driving that mandatory disclosure, it's about aligning with national indicators, and it's about provision of data. Thank you, Eva.
Thanks so much, Sharon. Excellent points, bringing it right home. We need the data at a national level if we're going to implement this through also the implementation of the GBF at a country level. So thank you for those insights. And now to really wrap up, I think that, you know, the science is clear that we need to reverse biodiversity loss and achieve a nature positive world by 2030. We can't question the fact that businesses have a critical responsibility to help achieve this objective. Even if you look back at Earth Overshoot Day, last year it happened on the 29th of July. That means humanities had used up all of the biological resources that the Earth regenerates during the entire year by the 29th of July. Humanity currently uses 1.7 Earths, so there's not enough time for natural systems to regenerate. There's strong scientific basis to justify that business needs to act now to reduce by at least half the negative impacts and to increase positive impacts. That's a key part of it. Increase positive impacts to contribute to a nature positive world. And I just want to reflect on this call before I hand over to Marcelo Bejar for the final words of this webinar. But just a reflection is that we've never had this much momentum in the business community on biodiversity, on nature. Nature has shot up the political agenda, the societal agenda, the business agenda in the last couple of years. We need to make sure that it stays there because it is the foundation of all of our societies, of all of our livelihoods, of all of our jobs and economy. And therefore, there is no business on a dead planet. We are absolutely thrilled to see this growing momentum in the business community, and we want to work together with you to make that a reality. And to wrap up this webinar, which I hope was helpful for all of you, we look forward to continuing the discussion. I'm going to hand over to Marcelo Bejar from Natura & Co., which is the Brazilian cosmetic company that has brands like Body Shop and Aesop companies, to conclude and tell us what we're hoping to see in Nairobi for the final negotiation meetings ahead of COP15. So thank you so much. Over to you, Marcelo.
Thank you so much, Eva, and great to hear everyone here today. I think we had some great content from everyone that spoke. And well, let's not get the complexity to impact our ambition, right? I think it's really important. We know it's the right thing to do. I think nature has now finally got into the center of the discussion, and acceleration will only happen if CBD shows leadership now. So I think we should learn from the climate agenda and how the climate agenda built its framework. Let's not waste another 10 years just because it seems a bit unclear how exactly it will be done and which exactly baseline will be used. I think it's important to move forward on the agenda. And we don't have the luxury of time. We operate in Brazil. We are watching the Amazon getting to its tipping points. So we see the same in forests in Central Africa, in Southeast Asia. The time to act is really now. And we are not sure, when we adopted the carbon agenda, we were not sure how to implement the 1.5 degree objective. So now we must have, that didn't stop us to set that as an objective and to start to reach everything that was needed to get there. So everyone now has net zero targets. We have a net zero agenda. The climate is set and it's well adopted. Now is the time to do the same thing with nature. So to set an ambitious agenda, to set an ambitious target, and to move forward on that direction. If you show the ambition, I'm sure that business will act and support the ambition for a new nature agenda. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Marcelo. And sorry, I realized as a moderator, I actually should have picked up on another comment in the chat, but you can do another replay of the motivational talk at the end. But one of the important points that came in the chat was, you know, what is the role of large companies like Natura and Co to support the SMEs in their value chain? So as we do have a minute, if it's okay, I'd love to hear your reflections. Thanks.
Yeah, and it's a great question because there is a connection between how we are framing the mandatory requirement for small business and for big businesses. And I think having common standards, and I think it shouldn't be voluntarily because we've been trying to operate on voluntarily basis and we are not getting there. So that's the true part of it. I think we should align, as Sharon said, there are objectives that should come from the public space, that should come from science, that should be enforced by finance, and that should be clear and being placed in a way that is comparable between small business and big businesses. So assuring that mandatory, every mandatory statement is placed under the new CBD global framework. It's really important to make sure that everyone is on the same level and leveling the playing field for everyone to operate in nature. So yeah,
thank you so much.
That enforces target 15, right?
It does, it does. Thank you so much, Marcelo, and to all the speakers and to all of you to have joined. I think we have a shared accountability and responsibility for the planet that we all call home. Let's work together. Marcelo said it, you've heard it from the speakers. If you set an ambitious global biodiversity framework, businesses are ready to implement and make it successful so that we can all live in a nature positive, net zero, equitable world by 2030. Thank you so much, all of you. Bye for now.